Hi, and welcome to week 11. So, this week we're going to cover chapter 10 on gender inequality. I hope you enjoyed that opening video. I like that one because it starts to introduce us into ideas or questions, rather, about the difference between sex and gender. Now, colloquially in everyday society, we tend to use those terms interchangeably, but they actually mean two very different things, especially to sociologists. So, sociologists see sex as something that's biological, biologically determined by human sex characteristics. These include things like chromosomes, hormones, primary sex characteristics like reproductive organs, genitalia, and then secondary sex characteristics that are developed in puberty, like breasts, broader shoulders, wider hips, hairy chest, hairy face, right? And the thing about sex is that we tend to think of it as very clear cut, right? Sex differentiates us as males and females. However, sex is actually not very clear cut. Your book talks about something referred to as intersexed. So, a person is deemed to be intersexed if they have a body that deviates from the standard male or standard female. And actually, about 1 in 1,000 people are born with a body that deviates from the standard male or standard female. When we think about, other types of bodies, for example, biological mutations, I have a niece that was only born with one hand, or you might be familiar with people being born with cleft palates. These are all examples of biological mutations, and they can affect any part of our body, including our reproductive organs, our genitalia, our hormone levels. And here is a young woman who was born biologically male. However, she has what's called AIS, or androgen insensitivity syndrome. So when she was born, her genitalia was formed as a vagina. She was identified as a female and socialized as a woman. And it wasn't until she was a little bit older that it was determined that she actually had testes. And she's an example of someone who is intersex, someone who has a body that deviates from the standard male or standard female. So, sex actually isn't very clear cut, which I think helps us understand gender a little bit more. So, sociologists look at gender as something that is social rather than biologically determined, socially determined. And when we look at gender in society, we tend to look at it on a scale of masculinity and femininity, or anywhere in there in between. Oftentimes in the middle is what's referred to as androgyny. We give and label certain characteristics and attitudes and traits and behaviors um, engendered ways as either feminine or masculine. And oftentimes we adopt these ideas of gender and form our own gender identity. Now, again, we tend to differentiate people as either feminine, therefore a girl or a woman, or masculine and therefore a boy or a man. But actually, there's a lot of variation in our society. Some people, yes, identifying themselves as a female and feminine, and as a girl or a woman, and those identifying themselves as masculine and male. And as a boy or a man, we would refer to these people as cisgender. However, there are people that don't necessarily fall within this gender binary, and might describe them themselves in a host of different ways. More and more in society, we're starting to hear voices from individuals that don't identify themselves as cisgender, who might identify themselves as androgynous, or who just might identify themselves as not being along that binary continuum. There are also individuals who are transgender, individuals who are biologically born male or female, but don't adhere to the characteristics associated with their sex at birth. And these individuals, again, are labeled as transgender. So here's Thomas Beatty, biologically born female, therefore able to carry and birth a child. However, his gender is as a man. This is Amanda Simpson, the first transgender presidential appointee, Chaz Bono. And here we have Fallon Fox, a MMA fighter. She was biologically born male, however, lives her life as a woman and has faced a lot of scrutiny and discrimination in society because of that, especially when we look at differences in body compositions between males and females. However, despite being born biologically male, Fallon Fox hasn't fared all that well in MMA fighting. So, when sociologists seek to understand gender and where ideas about gender come from, they look at gender as a social construction, something that has been socially created in society and then reified by our actions and our interactions. In one way that we kind of understand gender to be a social construction is that we see that there's changes in gender over time and over space. So, for example, these images here on the left are images of men meeting their children for the first time. We can see the man here at the top is standing outside of the labor and delivery ward. The nurse is holding the baby on another side of the glass in another room. These other men are dressed up in suits and presumably have come from work to meet their babies. There also were rules. These rules are actually taken from the 1970s, so not that long ago. Relating to the admission of husbands in the labor ward. So there were specific rules that had to be adhered to if husbands wanted to be in the labor ward. It wasn't something that was automatically expected or even allowed. However, today, when we look at children being born, we expect men to be there, to be part of the labor and delivery process. So here we see different expectations for men over time as it concerns the birth of their children. We also see different expectations for women. If we go back to the 1950s, most women were expected to be homemakers. Their primary duty or job was to take care of their households, to take care of their spouses, to take care of their children, and much different expectations today. For example, we see women outnumber men as it as it relates to college attendance. We also see that gender changes over space. So when we look at culture to culture, we see that there are different gendered expectations, even different allocations for understanding gender identities, right? And down here at the bottom left, we see Margaret Mead, who was an instrumental anthropologist in helping to discover some of the differences in gender cross-culturally. Now, how is gender constructed? How are ideas about gender passed on from one generation to the next? Here we go back to gender role socialization that, society teaches us to be masculine or feminine, and does so through the four main agents of socialization that we talked about back in chapter 4. So, our family being that primary agent of socialization by the way that they name us, the way that they dress us, the toys that they buy us, the colors that they surround us with, the way that they talk and interact with us, the chores that they give us to do, the expectations that they have of us, the activities that we engage in can all give us a sense of our gender expectations, our gender roles, directives that they give to us, reprimands that they give to us, curfews, again, can all be determined based on gender and help us form an identity around gender. Schools as well. Your textbook talks about the way that teachers interact with students, the expectations that teachers have of students, the different pathways and subject matter that teachers encourage students to explore are all different based upon gender. Media as well. When we look at books to television shows to videos to songs to pictures, full of ideas about gender. And here, I don't know if any of you as children read these Richard Scarry's books, but we can see that there has been a marked shift in the way that gender is portrayed in children's literature, allowing for much greater variety in expectations and roles based upon gender. And lastly, peers. Peers play a very critical role in gender and our understanding of gender. So here we have an image of two young boys, one's telling the other, "You're so gay." And this isn't a comment that is made about sexual orientation. Rather, it's a comment made to police gender. And perhaps you've heard that in your own life or experiences. One thing that's very interesting, some research that was done by sociologist Barbara Reisman has found that young boys have their gender policed much more than young girls. And there is actually a lot less wiggle room for young boys to engage in activities or behaviors outside those rigid gender roles, that those hegemonic masculine behaviors that society has prescribed to young men. And we'll talk a little bit later about how this actually can be pretty detrimental to young men, whereas we see much more flexibility for women. One way we can understand this is that, when young women engage or in behaviors that have been previously ascribed to men, they're seen as increasing their value and status in society. However, if young men engage in behaviors that have been previously ascribed to women, then they are kind of decreasing their status or value in society. Another interesting thing that we can look at with gender is language. Now, language can both reflect and shape culture, reflect the different gendered expectations and values, but also shape them as well. We're starting to see some change in the way that occupations are talked about, but still, it's not uncommon to hear someone refer to police officers as policemen. We have all of these terms that refer to people in general, however, just reference men: man made, mankind, manpower, manslaughter, human, all refer to people, however, have the word man in it. And we look at vehicles, traditionally and still in contemporary sense have been given women names, right? And if you think about it, these are things that are controlled, things that are possessed, things that are driven, perhaps reinforcing ideas about women in society. If we think about pet names that we give to women, chick, baby doll, right? Reinforcing this idea of something that is infantile, something that needs to be cared for, right? And oftentimes, one way to insult men in society is to refer to them as a woman. I had a close friend of mine say about another friend of his that he needs to get the sand out of his vagina. And that was supposed to be an insult because he was saying that his male friend had a vagina, right? And if a man was to have a vagina, that would make him less than. So again, language can also reinforce ideas about gender and about the value of different genders in our society. Now, not only do we learn gender, but we kind of take on a gender identity and engage in gendered behavior. West and Zimmerman, two sociologists that examine gender, gave the name doing gender to the activities we engage in that actively display ourselves and our gender identity. And one way to analyze this is looking at men and women in gyms. Now, of course, nothing is absolute, but overwhelmingly, when we see people engaged in group classes or group activities, we see that it is women engaging in these behaviors, these communal workout groups. However, when we look at men working out, we often see them in much more independent roles. And when they are working together, oftentimes it's a way to reinforce their power, right? Physical strength and prowess, one of the ways that masculinity actually is defined. So, the important thing about gender in our society is that gender influences one's situation in society, right? Our society is not only stratified by economics, by money, but also by gender. And this leads to gender inequality, overwhelmingly, which takes the form of patriarchy and in form of male domination. In the United States is no exception. Sexism for a long time has justified and in some senses continues to justify patriarchy, this idea that men are innately superior to women. Now, when we look at gender inequality in society, one place we see it is with work and income. Why is that? Well, there's a few explanations. One has to do with this idea of pink collar work, right? So when we look at labor force participation, we see that labor force participation for women has increased substantially over time, but it's still lower than men's labor force participation. However, when women do engage in the labor force, they're engaging it in a different way than men. They tend to dominate certain fields. compared to men and be left out pretty substantially of other fields. And what we see is that those fields that are overwhelmingly dominated by women tend to pay less than the fields that are overwhelmingly dominated by men. Another explanation for inequality as it comes to work and income is the glass ceiling, referring to the discrimination that women face in the workplace. So, when we look at the wages that women earn compared to men, we see that women only make about 82 cents for every dollar that their male counterpart earns. Um, and part of the explanation for this is the discrimination that women face in the workplace, whether it's subtle or overt. And then lastly, we see very large differences in childcare responsibilities. We see that women are engaged in greater amounts of childcare, and this could compromise their work and compromise their income. Now, there's a little bit of a debate here, right? Do women engage in greater childcare responsibilities because they are engaged in less paid labor, or do women compromise paid labor because they have childcare responsibilities? And to what extent do these childcare responsibilities have to do with gendered expectations? Right? Just as your book talks about men engaging in work and compromising family because of gendered expectations. One thing we see here is what Arlie Hochschild referred to as the second shift, kind of this second shift that women who are engaged in the paid labor force have to do when they come home and take care of the house and take care of the children. And we see that even when men and women work and work in equal amounts, earning equal um, amounts of pay, women still tend to engage in greater household and childcare responsibilities. Due to these discrepancies in work and income, we've seen this phenomenon of the feminization of poverty, talked about back in chapter 8, excuse me. This greater rate of women who are in poverty compared to men. Now, our sex and gender influence our life chances, that our experiences within families and our expectations within families are influenced by our gender, right? And one, I think, great example of this, particularly in inequality, is marriage. And we don't even have to look at marriage, we can just look at the wedding. Now, we're obviously here talking about a heterosexual couple. But if we look at the wedding, what color are women expected to wear in their wedding dress? It's white. And why white? Well, white, of course, represents or symbolizes virginity, right? Um, and we don't have the same expectation for men that they would wear a color that symbolized their virginity. Um, it's also very common and traditional for women to be walked down the aisle, particularly by their fathers, and quote unquote be given away, in the sense that property is exchanged from the father to the husband. And there's no clearer indication of this than when the woman takes her husband's last name and therefore becomes the Mrs. version of her husband. So, for example, Mrs. John Smith. Another area we see life chances impacted is health. We see actually that women live longer than men. A lot of this has to do with the choices that men and women make. Men are more likely to engage in risky behavior. They're less likely to seek out medical care. They're more likely to work in jobs that pose greater risks to their health. They're more likely to be victims of violent crime in the criminal justice system, engage in the criminal justice system, all of these things which could compromise their health, discrepancies in education as well. While we're seeing greater numbers of women outnumber men in higher education, we see huge disparities in terms of their areas of study, which also impact work and income. Politics. We're seeing greater and greater amounts of women engaged in politics, but if you look at this chart down here, the United States still pales in comparison to other high income countries or economically developed countries. However, in this last election, the 2018 midterm elections, we see that we have the greatest rates of women and the most diverse group of candidates ever in the history of the United States. So there will be at least 123 women in the United States Congress, making up about 23% of the Congress. Lastly, the criminal justice system. Men are much more likely to be arrested, much more likely to be perpetrators of violent crime, and also more likely to be victims of violent crime, with the exception of sexually violent crimes. Which brings us to this, concern of sexual crimes against women. Overwhelmingly, as you can see in these images here, women are sexually objectified in society. And all of these images here, all of these images that are selling products, reinforce the idea that what is most important about a woman is her body utilized in a sexually objective way, her body turned into an object, her body dismembered, right? Her body put in a subordinate position, a vulnerable position as well. Again, reinforcing the idea that what is most important about a woman is how her body can be utilized for in a sexual way for the sexual gratification of another person as an object, right? So not so much as a person, but rather as an object. And we see this kind of comically portrayed and reinforced when men position themselves as women have traditionally been in sexualized positions. It becomes comical. Now, one concern about the sexual objectification of women is that it reinforces this message in society that what is, again, most important about women is the use of her body in a sexual way, this devaluation of women. And here I think this is kind of an interesting ad here, right? She didn't want to do it, but she couldn't say no. When your friends drink, they can end up making bad decisions, like going home with someone they don't know very well. Decisions like that leave them vulnerable to dangers like date rape. Help your friends stay in control and stay safe. Now, while this PSA is meant to protect women from sexual assaults and rape, it reinforces the idea that is a woman's fault that she is engaged, that she has been a victim of a sexual crime, right? And there's this criticism that in our society, um, instead of teaching "don't rape," we overwhelmingly send the message, particularly to women, "don't get raped." So rather than a society that teaches "don't rape," we have a society that teaches "don't rape," but she was pretty drunk and she didn't explicitly say no, and look at what she was wearing. This is problematic because what we really want is a society where "don't rape" means don't rape, don't assault, don't harass, don't intimidate, don't abuse, don't take advantage of a situation, whether you're male, female, or anything in between, right? And society teaches us all strange men are dangerous instead of look out for yourself, because there are always going to be expletive out there. But remember that society has your back and that the hammer of justice will be swift and mighty in your defense, because no one should ever touch you without your express consent, and that goes for everyone regardless of gender, right? Kind of trying to send this message that it's not so much short skirts that rape, rather rapist rape. And we've seen this outcry from society recently, particularly as we've seen high profile individuals and celebrities be accused and convicted of sexual assaults. Now, men are sexually objectified in society as well, as these images show. What's becomes most important about their bodies in a sexual way is their ability to perform sexually, right? Their ability to have large, erect penises, and then that has a bearing on their masculinity. So it's kind of interesting, whereas women are sexually objectified in a way that makes them vulnerable and turned into an object, men are sexually objectified in a way that actually increases their power. And when we're looking at things like sexual assault, it is not about sexual gratification, it is about power, and it is about control. As your book notes, it's important to understand that when we look at rapes, the majority of rape victims are women, but men certainly can be and are victims of rape as well. Now, when men are victims of rape, oftentimes the perpetrator are other heterosexual men. Again, it's not about sexual gratification, it's about power and it's about control. So, how do we explain these inequalities? How do we explain inequalities in income between men and women? How do we explain inequalities of experiences in society between men and women? And not just men and women, but men and women and cisgender and transgender and non binary individuals in our society. Well, the functionalists would say that some social roles are better suited to one gender, and this leads to social stability. If we have everybody performing their particular roles, and we have all roles fulfilled in society. Talcott Parsons particularly identifying differences between men tending to be in instrumental roles and women tending to perform expressive roles. Again, this idea that all roles are engaged in, therefore all roles are met, and this leads to stability in society. Functionalists, therefore, would see gendered society as one that is a positive society. Conflict theorists, however, are pretty critical of gendered inequalities stemming from one's access to society's material resources and privileges, or the denial of that access to society's material resources and privileges, all based on gender. In a society in which men's interest would be to maintain their dominant position and women's interest would be to challenge it, whether this is looking at marital relationships, within institutions of religion, or within the business world, we can see that overwhelmingly there is greater power and greater economic resources that is distributed to men as compared to women. Symbolic interactionalists are much more interested in those micro level interactions that contribute to the social construction of gender, and particularly how gender is maintained and reproduced in our everyday lives. So, looking at how we do gender, for example, would be a symbolic interactionalist analysis of gender inequality. And some examples we have as Nora Vincent went undercover, more or less as a man, to see how people interacted with her because they identified her as a man compared to when she was identified as a woman. As well as this Don't Be Sorry, Be Strong and Shine commercial that I'll post down below, reinforcing this idea how women are socialized to apologize, to take up less space. And how this reinforces the idea, and even smile, right? Reinforces the idea that women are less valued in society, have lower status in society. So as we look at gender, and gender inequality in society, one thing that has contributed to changes and making society a more equal society is the women's movement focused on feminism. Now, feminism is something interesting, something that's still certainly a debated concept in society. Some people very strongly supporting feminism, and some people staunchly opposing it. I encourage you to ask somebody, whether they're a feminist and what does feminism mean. And overwhelmingly, you're going to get people who conjure this image of a bra burning, man hating, angry woman. When in fact, the definition of feminism, and therefore a feminist, is someone who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. Equality being a core value in the United States. And so while most people would identify themselves affirmatively in one who believes in equality of the sexes, they might not identify themselves as a feminist. And why is that? So, the women's movement or the feminist movement has been identified as taking place in three different waves. The first wave focused on political rights for women, which ended in 1920 when women gained the right to vote in the United States. The second wave, focusing on equal access to employment and education, which really kind of garnered a lot of support in the 1950s through the 1970s. Through this, we have the passage of Title VII and the passage of Title IX, both very important pieces of legislation that have allowed women greater access to higher education and protections within the workplace. Now, some people would say we're still in this second wave of feminism. We still don't have equality based on gender. However, one response to the second wave of feminism was that it was a wave that was overwhelmingly dominated by white middle class women, and it left out women who were poor, and it left out women who were non white, and it left out women who had other identities, perhaps that were people who were transgender, people who were non binary, people who were poor and non white, and women. So we've started to see this third wave of feminism focus on intersectionality and the diversity and identities that we have within the feminist movement. And the feminist movement has certainly given way to feminist theory. Now, your book talks about 5 different feminist theories. And what's most important about all of them is they tend to explain the world from a woman or a women centered perspective, something that has historically been left out from theoretical perspectives. And they all focus on injustices and the unequal division of power in society. However, they differ on the sources of this inequality between men and women in society, as well as on the ways to achieve equality in society. So, for your reflection journal, I'm really interested in your ability to apply different feminist theories to media depicting ideas about gender. Now, I want to leave with this idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality is so important to understanding stratification in our society. That when we look at people's experiences, we can't say that they have experiences just because of their gender or just because of their social class, or as we'll talk about next week, just because of their race. That as people experience the world, they experience it according to all the different identities that they have, and these identities intersect with one another. And when we're talking about inequality, oftentimes, if a person is in more than one minority group, meaning they are in more than one kind of group that is disadvantaged in society, these disadvantages can compound to impact their experiences. So, not all women experience the world the same, and not all men experience the world the same. We have to also consider things like social class and race and sexual orientation. And other dimensions of identity, ableism, and age that would impact their experiences. So I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture and that you enjoy exploring a little bit more about gender and yourself in the coming week.